the sun dipped low over the Montana countryside, casting long golden streaks across the fields. A warm breeze carried the scent of pine and earth through the open window of an old farmhouse, where Margaret O'Connell, Maggie to those who loved her, rocked gently in her chair on the front porch. At her feet lay Charlie, her faithful golden retriever, his thick coat gleaming in the last light of day. His deep brown eyes, wise and gentle, followed Maggie's every movement, as if he understood that time was slipping away. Maggie had always been a strong woman, one of those rare souls who carried both the weight of the past and the hope of the future. She had raised her daughter Sarah alone after her husband's passing, tending to their land with quiet resilience. Though the years had slowed her body, her spirit remained bright. She had lived long enough to see her daughter grow into a strong woman and was now awaiting the arrival of her first grandchild. "You take care of them, okay, old boy?" Maggie murmured, scratching behind Charlie's ears. He let out a low, contented sigh, pressing his head against her frail hand. Charlie had been by Maggie's side for nearly a decade, a constant presence in the quiet rhythms of her life. He had been there when Sarah moved away for college, when the house grew too silent, and when Maggie's hands grew tired from years of labor. He had walked with her through every season, through the first snowfall in November, the soft bloom of spring, and the long, golden summers when she sat on this very porch, watching the world settle into dusk. But this evening was different. Maggie could feel it in the air, in the way her breath came slower, in the way Charlie lifted his head, sensing something beyond what human eyes could see. Later that night, Maggie went to bed as she always did, pulling the quilt up to her chin, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. Charlie curled up beside her bed, his soft breathing the only sound in the room. As sleep took her, a deep and peaceful stillness settled over the house. By morning, Maggie was gone. Sarah found her mother still tucked beneath the quilt, her face peaceful, as if she had simply drifted away on the quiet tide of the night. Charlie remained at the foot of the bed, his head resting on his paws, watching over her as if standing guard over something precious. In the days that followed, the house filled with mourners, with whispered condolences and the scent of lilies. But through it all, Charlie did not leave Maggie's room. He lay beside her empty bed, his eyes full of a sorrow no words could express. Then, just as Sarah was about to close the door to her mother's room for the last time, Charlie stirred. He turned his head toward the crib in the corner, where a newborn baby slept, and without hesitation, he rose and lay beside it. His watch was not yet over. The house felt emptier after Maggie was gone. The walls that once echoed with her laughter now held only silence, and the scent of lavender, her favorite, lingered faintly in the air, as if refusing to fade entirely. Sarah moved through the house with slow, careful steps, her arms wrapped around her newborn son, Ethan. The funeral had come and gone, leaving behind only the weight of loss. Friends and neighbors had offered their condolences, but nothing could fill the absence of her mother. Charlie, however, seemed to take the loss harder than anyone. He had always been by Maggie's side, never straying far from her presence. Now, without her, he moved through the house as if searching for something he knew he would never find. He sniffed at her empty rocking chair, lay beside her bed at night, and often let out low whimpers, as if calling for her in a language only he understood. Yet, despite his grief, Charlie never left Ethan's side. From the moment Maggie's body had been carried from the house, he had stationed himself beside the crib, his golden fur a warm presence against the cold reality of loss. Sarah had noticed it immediately. Each time she rocked Ethan to sleep, Charlie sat at her feet, his deep brown eyes watching with quiet devotion. If Ethan so much as stirred, Charlie's ears perked, his body tense, ready to respond before Sarah even had a chance to rise from her chair. It was as if Maggie had whispered one final request to him before she passed: "Take care of them, Charlie. Keep them safe." And Charlie took that promise seriously. The first time Sarah truly realized the depth of Charlie's devotion was on a cold January night, just a few weeks after Ethan was born. Exhausted from another sleepless night, she had finally laid Ethan down in his crib and stumbled to bed, desperate for even an hour of rest. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Sarah had just begun to drift into sleep when Charlie let out a sharp bark. Sarah sat up, her heart hammering in her chest. Another bark, low, urgent. Then the unmistakable sound of scratching against the nursery door. Confused and still half asleep, she threw off the covers and hurried down the hall, Charlie's barking growing more insistent. When she pushed open the door, she froze. Ethan's tiny face was red, his breath short and quick. He was struggling to inhale, his little chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow movements. Panic surged through Sarah as she scooped him up, her hands trembling. "Ethan? Baby, look at me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over her pounding heartbeat. Charlie let out a soft whimper, standing on his hind legs to rest his paws on the crib, his eyes locked onto Ethan. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat, wrapped Ethan tightly in a blanket, and rushed out the door, Charlie right at her heels. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what she had feared: Ethan had developed a severe respiratory infection. If she had waited any longer, his oxygen levels would have dropped to dangerous levels. "You got here just in time," the doctor told her, offering a reassuring smile. "He's going to be okay." Sarah held Ethan close, pressing her lips against his forehead, tears of relief spilling onto his soft skin. It wasn't until later, as she sat in the hospital chair with Ethan asleep in her arms, that she realized what had happened. Charlie had known. He had sensed the danger before she had. And he had saved Ethan's life. From that night on, Sarah trusted Charlie in a way she never had before. She noticed how he moved with an almost supernatural awareness of Ethan's needs. If the baby was restless, Charlie paced beside the crib, as if willing him back to sleep. When Sarah carried Ethan outside for fresh air, Charlie positioned himself protectively between them and the rest of the world, his keen eyes scanning the surroundings as if watching for unseen threats. It wasn't just about protection, it was something deeper, something Sarah couldn't quite explain. It was as if Charlie wasn't just watching over Ethan, he was carrying a piece of Maggie's love with him, ensuring that it never truly left. Neighbors and friends noticed it, too. "That dog never leaves that baby's side," Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman from down the road, remarked one afternoon when she stopped by for tea. Sarah smiled, watching as Charlie lay beside Ethan's play mat, his head resting on his paws. "Sometimes I think he still hears my mom," she admitted softly. Mrs. Thompson patted her hand gently. "Maybe he does," she said. As the months passed, Ethan grew stronger, his laughter filling the house that had once been so silent. Charlie remained his ever-present guardian, his golden fur always within arm's reach. Then, one evening in late spring, a storm rolled in. The winds howled through the valley, rattling the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. Sarah hurried through the house, checking that everything was secure before heading upstairs to put Ethan to bed. Charlie, however, was restless. He paced back and forth near the front door, his ears twitching with every gust of wind. "Charlie, it's just a storm," Sarah reassured him, scratching behind his ears. But he didn't relax. Later that night, as the rain pounded against the roof, Sarah awoke with a start. Charlie was barking again, loud, frantic. She sat up, her pulse quickening. Then, through the storm, she heard it. A faint, distant cry. Not Ethan's. A different sound, coming from outside. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and ran to the window, scanning the darkness. The rain blurred her vision, but then she saw it, movement near the front gate. She opened the door just as Charlie bolted past her, his powerful legs carrying him toward the fence. And then she saw what he had been trying to tell her. A young boy, no older than 5, stood outside in the pouring rain, shivering and alone. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she rushed forward, scooping him up in her arms. His small body was freezing, his clothes soaked through. "What are you doing out here, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice shaking. The boy, too weak to answer, clung to her tightly. Charlie pressed close, his body warm against the child, his fur absorbing some of the rain. Sarah didn't know where the boy had come from or how he had ended up there, but she knew one thing for certain. Charlie had saved another life that night. As Sarah sat by the fire later, the boy wrapped in a warm blanket, Ethan sleeping peacefully in his crib, she looked at Charlie. "You knew," she murmured. "Just like Mom would have." Charlie blinked slowly, resting his head against her knee. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah didn't feel so alone. Maggie may have been gone, but a part of her still remained, watching, protecting, loving. Through Charlie. Through the guardian who had kept his promise. Time had a way of slipping by unnoticed in the quiet countryside. Seasons changed, the trees turned golden, then bare, then green again, but one thing remained constant: Charlie's unwavering devotion to Ethan. By the time Ethan was a toddler, he and Charlie were inseparable. It wasn't just the way the dog watched over him, the way he always positioned himself between the boy and anything unfamiliar. It was something deeper, something unspoken. Ethan was too young to remember his grandmother, too young to understand loss, but somehow, whenever he was with Charlie, there was a quiet sense of peace about him. As if, even before he could speak in full sentences, he knew Charlie wasn't just a pet. He was something more. The first time Ethan walked on his own, it was because of Charlie. Sarah had been sitting on the porch, watching her son attempt to take shaky steps across the grass. He would push himself up, wobble, and then collapse into a fit of giggles, never discouraged but never quite making it more than a step or two. Charlie sat a few feet away, watching patiently, his tail thumping against the ground. Then, something shifted. Ethan locked eyes with Charlie, his tiny hands clenching into fists, his face scrunched in determination. He took a step, one, then another. His arms wavered, but he kept going. His eyes never left Charlie's. And then, with one final lurch forward, he fell right into Charlie's waiting paws. Instead of crying, Ethan laughed, burying his tiny hands into the golden fur that had caught him. Charlie let out a low huff, as if he had been expecting this all along. Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek, watching as Ethan leaned into Charlie, patting his side as if to say, "See? I did it." From that day on, wherever Ethan went, Charlie followed. As Ethan's vocabulary grew, so did his attachment to Charlie. Sarah would often catch him sitting on the floor beside the dog, chattering away as if he were talking to an old friend. He would tell Charlie about his day, about the birds he had seen outside, about the strange shapes he saw in the clouds. Charlie, for his part, listened. He always listened. Sometimes, Ethan would giggle and whisper, "Grandma says you're a good boy." Sarah would freeze at those words. It wasn't that she didn't believe in the idea of something beyond this world, it was just that Ethan had never known his grandmother. He had never heard her voice, never listened to the way she used to call Charlie old boy the same way Ethan now did. But when she asked him about it, Ethan would simply shrug and say, "I just know." And that was that. It wasn't just Ethan who seemed to feel Maggie's presence when Charlie was near. One summer afternoon, Sarah had been folding laundry in the living room, humming a song her mother used to sing when she was a child. Ethan was playing with his toy cars on the floor, and Charlie was sprawled beside him, his head resting on his paws. And then the rocking chair moved. It wasn't a strong movement, just a soft creak, a slight sway back and forth. Sarah turned sharply, her heart skipping a beat. The chair had been her mother's favorite. She had spent countless evenings sitting there, knitting or reading, always with Charlie at her feet. But now, Maggie was gone. And no one had touched the chair. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked at Charlie. His ears had perked up, his body suddenly still. He was staring at the chair, watching it the way he used to watch Maggie. Ethan, unbothered, simply said, "She's just checking on us." Sarah's hands trembled as she folded the last shirt, her eyes never leaving the chair. Charlie let out a soft sigh, resting his head back down as if he, too, had felt her presence. One autumn night, Ethan fell sick with a fever. Sarah had been up with him for hours, pressing cold cloths to his forehead, whispering reassurances as he tossed and turned. It was one of those nights where exhaustion and worry weighed heavy, where every minute felt stretched too thin. Charlie refused to leave the boy's side. He lay beside Ethan's bed, his eyes never closing, his body tense as if he were standing guard. And then, in the stillness of the night, Sarah swore she heard something, a voice, so soft it could have been the wind. "He'll be all right." It was Maggie's voice. Sarah's breath hitched, her hands tightening on the cloth she held. Charlie's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Ethan's breathing slowed, his fever breaking not long after. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at her son, at the golden retriever who had never left his side, and she whispered, "Thank you, Mom." Charlie's devotion wasn't just about love, it was about protection. One evening, Sarah had taken Ethan to the nearby lake for a picnic. The water was calm, reflecting the soft pinks and oranges of the setting sun. Ethan, now a confident 3-year-old, was playing near the shore, his tiny hands tossing pebbles into the water. Sarah had turned away for just a moment, reaching into the picnic basket. When she looked up, Ethan had wandered further than she realized, his feet splashing in the shallow water, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Charlie, who had been lying beside her, shot up. Before Sarah could even call out, Charlie was at Ethan's side, nudging him back toward the shore with firm, insistent movements. Ethan, confused but obedient, let Charlie guide him away. Seconds later, a large branch, loosened from an old tree, crashed into the water exactly where Ethan had been standing. Sarah's heart pounded as she pulled Ethan into her arms, holding him tightly. Charlie sat beside them, watching the ripples in the water, his ears alert. He had known. Somehow, he had known. Sarah buried her face in Ethan's hair, whispering a silent thank you, not just to Charlie, but to the presence she could still feel lingering in the quiet. By the time Ethan was old enough to understand loss, he already knew, in his own way, that his grandmother had never truly left. Charlie had been her last gift to them, her last promise. He was more than a dog. He was a bridge between what had been and what still remained. And though he couldn't speak, though he couldn't explain the things he saw and sensed, he didn't need to. Because love, the kind of love that transcends time, the kind that lingers in golden fur and rocking chairs and whispered reassurances in the night, never truly fades. It simply finds new ways to stay. The Montana countryside had a way of holding on to memories, keeping the past alive in subtle, quiet ways. The rocking chair that still swayed when no one was near. The faint scent of lavender that sometimes lingered in the hallway. The way Charlie would suddenly lift his head, ears twitching, as if he had heard a voice only he could understand. Sarah had long stopped questioning these things. Some moments weren't meant to be explained, only felt. But some moments made her pause. Some moments made her wonder if Maggie was closer than she dared to believe. It was a bitter January night when the first true sign came. The fire in the living room burned low, casting flickering light across the wooden floors. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes, sending icy drafts creeping through the cracks of the old house. Sarah had been exhausted. Days of chasing after a lively 4-year-old had drained her, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, she had fallen into a deep sleep. Charlie, however, was not resting. He paced near the bedroom door, his body tense, his ears perked. Then, suddenly, he let out a sharp bark. Sarah stirred but didn't wake. Another bark, louder this time, urgent. Then the unmistakable sound of scratching against Ethan's door. Sarah jolted awake. Her heart pounded as she threw off the covers and ran down the hallway. The moment she stepped into Ethan's room, the cold hit her. The window was open, the winter air rushing in, chilling the room to near freezing. Ethan lay curled beneath his blanket, his lips slightly parted, his breath slow, too slow. Her heart clenched in panic. She rushed to his side, shaking him gently. His skin was cold to the touch. "Oh, baby," she whispered, wrapping him tightly in his quilt. She lifted him into her arms, his small body limp but stirring slightly. Charlie whined beside her, pressing his nose against Ethan's cheek. Sarah held Ethan close, rocking him near the fire until his body warmed, until his breathing deepened. Only then did she look at Charlie. "You knew," she murmured. Charlie let out a deep sigh, settling beside Ethan, as if his job for the night had just been completed. And in that moment, as Sarah sat holding her son, she could have sworn she heard a whisper, soft, gentle, familiar. "He's safe now." One summer afternoon, Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, watching Ethan and Charlie play in the yard. The golden retriever sat beside the boy, his body relaxed but watchful. Then, just for a second, Sarah saw something. A shadow. It moved behind Ethan, tall, faint, gone in an instant. Sarah blinked, shaking off the unease. But then Charlie's body stiffened. His ears shot up, his tail lowered, and he turned toward the space where the shadow had been. A low growl rumbled from his throat. Sarah's breath caught. She dropped the dish she had been holding and ran outside. "Ethan, come here," she called, trying to keep her voice calm. Ethan turned, confused but obedient, and ran toward her. Charlie remained where he was, his gaze locked on the treeline. Sarah scanned the yard. Nothing. No one. Charlie slowly relaxed, his growl fading, but his eyes still held that knowing look. Sarah knelt, pulling Ethan close. "Did you see anything, sweetheart?" Ethan shook his head. "Just playing with Charlie." Charlie wagged his tail and nudged Ethan's hand. But before Sarah carried him inside, she cast one last glance at the trees. She never saw the shadow again. But sometimes, when she looked out the window at just the right moment, she swore she felt someone watching. Ethan's 5th birthday was a bright spring afternoon. The house was filled with laughter, family, and the smell of freshly baked cake. When it came time for Ethan to make a wish, Sarah set the cake in front of him, lighting a single candle at the center. "Make a wish," she said. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, took a deep breath, and blew. The flame flickered, then, for just a brief second, it sparked back to life. Sarah's breath caught. Ethan giggled. "Grandma liked my wish." Sarah stared at him. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Ethan shrugged, smiling. "I just know." Charlie thumped his tail against the floor, letting out a low huff, as if he, too, knew something Sarah didn't. Sarah never asked what Ethan had wished for. Some things weren't meant to be questioned. By now, Sarah had stopped trying to explain it. Charlie wasn't just a dog. He was a bridge between the past and the present, a guardian of a love that refused to fade. Through the rocking chair that sometimes moved when no one was near. Through the whispers in the wind that came when she least expected them. Through the warmth that settled over her heart, telling her, without a doubt, that Maggie had never truly left. She had simply found a new way to stay. Years passed, but some things never changed. Ethan was growing fast, his once tiny hands now strong enough to climb trees and toss a baseball. But no matter how much time passed, Charlie never left his side. Sarah often watched them from the porch, the golden retriever always a step behind Ethan, always watching, always protecting. It was a comfort, a constant presence in their lives that felt as natural as breathing. But there was one night, one final moment, that made Sarah realize something she had always felt but never dared to say aloud. Charlie wasn't just watching over Ethan. He wasn't just a dog. He was carrying a part of Maggie with him. It had been an ordinary day, warm, filled with laughter, the smell of fresh-cut grass lingering in the air. Ethan had spent the afternoon playing in the backyard, racing through the fields with Charlie at his heels. By nightfall, a storm had rolled in, bringing with it the kind of rain that turned roads to rivers and sent wind howling through the trees. Sarah had tucked Ethan into bed and stood by his window for a moment, watching the lightning flash across the sky. Then she saw it. Charlie sat at the foot of Ethan's bed, as he always did. But this time, his head was lifted, his ears twitching. He was staring at the rocking chair. Sarah's breath caught. The chair was moving. Slow, steady, rocking, just as it had when Maggie used to sit in it, knitting blankets and humming lullabies. A chill ran down Sarah's spine, but she didn't feel fear. She felt warmth. Love. Charlie let out a soft whimper, his tail wagging slightly. He wasn't scared. He wasn't alarmed. He knew. Sarah's hands trembled as she took a step forward. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with something unseen but deeply familiar. Then, in the quiet, she heard it. He's safe. You've done well. It wasn't a voice that could be explained. It wasn't something spoken out loud. But Sarah heard it all the same. She pressed a hand to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. Charlie turned his head, looking at her, his deep brown eyes holding a wisdom beyond his years. And in that moment, Sarah understood. Maggie had never truly left. She had simply stayed in the only way she could, in the warmth of a golden retriever's fur, in the watchful eyes that never left her grandson. Charlie had been more than a dog. He had been a guardian. A promise fulfilled. Charlie grew older, his steps slower, his once bright golden coat streaked with silver. Ethan, now 10, was old enough to notice the change. "Is Charlie sick?" he asked one evening as the dog lay by the fireplace, his breathing deep, his tail barely thumping. Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "He's just tired." Ethan curled up beside him, stroking his fur, his small fingers tracing the patterns of age. "Grandma says he's been the best boy." Sarah's breath hitched. "What did you say?" she whispered. Ethan didn't look up. "She told me. She says she'll take care of him." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't question it. She only nodded, running her fingers through Charlie's fur. That night, Charlie lay beside Ethan's bed as he always had. But this time, when the morning came, he didn't stir. He was gone. Peacefully, in the quiet of the night. Sarah sat beside Ethan, holding him close as he cried. But as she wiped his tears, a soft breeze drifted through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender. And the rocking chair swayed, just once. A love that never leaves. They buried Charlie beneath the old oak tree in the backyard, the same place where he had once run with Ethan through golden fields. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat beside his grave, his hand resting on the earth. "She's happy," he murmured. Sarah blinked. "Who is?" Ethan smiled, looking up at the sky. "Grandma. She says thank you." A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek. She pulled Ethan close, kissing the top of his head. And as they sat in the fading light, the wind rustled the leaves, carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Maggie had never left. She had simply found a way to stay. The house felt different after Charlie was gone. It wasn't just the absence of the soft patting of his paws on the wooden floors or the quiet huff he let out whenever he settled by Ethan's feet. It was the silence, the kind that stretched just a little too long, as if something was missing. Ethan noticed it first. "He's still here," he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sky turn gold and pink. His small hands traced lazy circles on the wooden steps, his face calm. Sarah looked at him, swallowing the lump in her throat. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Ethan shrugged. "I just know." He pointed toward the old oak tree where Charlie was buried. "Grandma says he's happy. He did what he was supposed to do." Sarah didn't question it. She had stopped questioning things a long time ago. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the evening breeze wash over her, carrying with it the familiar scent of lavender. Maggie's scent. Months passed, and though the ache of losing Charlie never truly faded, life found a way of moving forward. One afternoon, as Sarah and Ethan walked through town, they passed by the local animal shelter. The sight of the wagging tails and hopeful eyes behind the kennel doors tugged at something deep inside Sarah, but she hesitated. Then Ethan stopped. He pressed his hands against the glass, staring at a small golden retriever puppy curled up in the corner of the kennel. "That one," he said. Sarah looked at the tiny ball of fur, its sleepy brown eyes barely opening to meet hers. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded. "Grandma says we're ready now." A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek, but she smiled. That evening, the puppy curled up at Ethan's feet, just as Charlie had done for years. Sarah sat in the rocking chair, running her fingers over the soft fabric of Maggie's old quilt. It had been so long since she had felt truly at peace. Then, just as she was about to close her eyes, the chair moved. A single, slow rock. Sarah let out a quiet laugh, wiping her tears. "I know, Mom," she whispered. The wind outside picked up, rustling the leaves of the oak tree, carrying something more than just the evening air. A presence. A promise. A love that had never left. And as Ethan drifted off to sleep, his small hand resting on the new puppy's back, Sarah knew, with certainty, with peace, that Maggie and Charlie were still watching. Still loving. Still home.